The rain hammered against the windows of Heathrow Airport as Sergeant James Mitchell stood in the check-in queue, his military uniform pressed to perfection. The Victoria Cross medal pinned to his chest caught the fluorescent lights overhead, its bronze surface telling a story of courage that few could comprehend. James had served in the Royal Guards for 15 years, and the last 3 had been the most challenging of his life. He was finally heading home after a grueling deployment in a conflict zone where he had saved the lives of 12 soldiers under heavy enemy fire. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to catch flights, families saying tearful goodbyes, and business people glued to their phones. James carried only a small duffel bag containing his essential belongings. He had learned long ago to travel light. His broad shoulders and upright posture made him stand out in the crowd, even among the sea of people. Several passengers glanced at his uniform with respect, some even nodding in acknowledgement of his service. When James finally reached the airline counter, a young woman with bright red lipstick and a stiff smile greeted him. Her name tag read Sandra. She barely looked up from her computer screen as she extended her hand for his ticket. James handed over his boarding pass and passport, expecting the routine process that usually took just a few minutes. He was looking forward to the flight, a chance to rest his weary body and mind after months of tension and danger. Sandra scanned his documents, and suddenly, her expression changed. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion, then something that resembled annoyance. She typed frantically on her keyboard, her long fingernails clicking against the keys like tiny hammers. James noticed her supervisor, a tall man with thinning hair and a permanent frown, glancing in their direction. Something was wrong, but James could not imagine what it could be. After what felt like an eternity, Sandra looked up at him with cold eyes. Her voice was sharp and dismissive as she spoke words that James would never forget. She informed him that there had been an error with his booking, and that his seat had been given to another passenger. James blinked in disbelief, his tired mind struggling to process what he was hearing. He had confirmed his reservation 3 times before arriving at the airport. He explained this calmly, maintaining the discipline that had been drilled into him throughout his military career. Sandra's response was even more shocking. She told him that military personnel were not priority passengers, and that he would have to wait for the next available flight, which would not depart until the following afternoon. James felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had promised his elderly mother that he would be home that evening. She had been ill, and he had not seen her in 8 months. The thought of disappointing her made his chest tighten with emotion. James tried to explain his situation, his voice remaining steady despite the frustration building inside him. He mentioned his mother's condition and the fact that he had served his country with honor. Sandra barely listened. She was already waving to the next passenger in line, clearly dismissing him. Her supervisor approached, and James hoped for a moment that reason would prevail. Instead, the supervisor supported Sandra's decision, adding that company policy did not make exceptions for military personnel, regardless of their service record or medals. The other passengers in the queue began to take notice of the situation. Some whispered among themselves, while others pulled out their phones. James felt the weight of their stares, but he refused to create a scene. He had been trained to maintain composure under pressure, and he would not abandon that training now. He simply asked if there was any way to resolve the issue, perhaps by speaking with a manager or finding an alternative solution. The supervisor's response was cold and bureaucratic. He told James that the decision was final, and that if he continued to argue, security would be called to escort him from the airport. The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. James felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, not out of aggression but out of sheer frustration and helplessness. Here he was, a decorated soldier who had risked his life for his country, being treated like a nuisance by an airline that cared more about policies than people. As James stepped away from the counter, his heart heavy with disappointment, he noticed a woman in her 50s watching the entire exchange. She had tears in her eyes and approached him cautiously. She thanked him for his service and expressed her disgust at how he had been treated. Her words provided a small comfort, but they could not change his situation. James thanked her politely and walked toward a row of seats near the large windows overlooking the runway. He sat down heavily, his duffel bag dropping to the floor beside him. Outside, planes took off and landed in the steady rain, their lights cutting through the gray afternoon sky. James pulled out his phone and called his mother. Her frail voice answered after 3 rings filled with anticipation and joy. Telling her that he would not be home until the next day was one of the hardest things James had ever done. She tried to hide her disappointment, telling him that one more day would not matter, but he could hear the sadness in her voice. After ending the call, James sat in silence, staring at the Victoria Cross on his chest. He thought about the day he had received it, standing before military officials and fellow soldiers who had cheered his bravery. He remembered the weight of responsibility that came with the medal, the reminder that he represented something greater than himself. Now in this cold airport terminal, that medal seemed to mean nothing to the people who were supposed to serve the public. Unknown to James, several passengers who had witnessed his treatment at the check-in counter were not content to let the matter rest. One of them, a journalist named Rebecca Thompson, had recorded parts of the exchange on her phone. She was appalled by what she had seen and immediately began writing a post for her social media account, which had over 200,000 followers. Her fingers flew across her phone screen as she described the incident, including details about James's Victoria Cross and the callous treatment he had received. Within minutes of posting, Rebecca's account of the incident began to spread across social media platforms like wildfire. People shared it with angry comments about the airline's behavior and expressions of support for James. The post reached thousands, then tens of thousands of people. News outlets picked up the story, recognizing its potential to spark public outrage. James sat unaware of the storm brewing online. His mind focused only on the disappointment of not being able to see his mother that evening. The airline's corporate office, located in a gleaming tower in central London, remained oblivious to the growing crisis. Their social media team had logged off for the day, and the customer service department was handling routine complaints. Nobody realized that a decision made by a check-in supervisor at Heathrow was about to bring down a firestorm of criticism on their company. The story was spreading beyond social media now, reaching television news producers who were always hungry for stories that captured public emotion. As evening descended on London, the story of James Mitchell's treatment at Heathrow Airport had become the most talked-about topic on British social media. Hashtags demanding justice for the decorated soldier trended nationally, with millions of people expressing their anger and disappointment. Television news programs interrupted their regular schedules to report on the incident, showing Rebecca Thompson's video footage and interviewing passengers who had witnessed the exchange at the check-in counter. James remained at the airport, having found a quiet corner near a coffee shop where he could wait out the long hours until his rescheduled flight. He had no idea that his face was appearing on television screens across the country, or that his name was being mentioned in thousands of social media posts. He simply sat with a cup of tea growing cold in his hands, watching the planes outside and thinking about his mother alone at home, probably sitting by the window waiting for a car that would not arrive. The airline's chief executive officer, Martin Bradshaw, was attending a charity dinner in an exclusive restaurant when his phone began buzzing incessantly. At first he ignored it, assuming it was routine business that could wait until morning. But when his director of communications burst into the restaurant, her face pale with panic, Martin knew something serious had happened. She pulled him aside and showed him her tablet, where news articles and social media posts about James Mitchell filled the screen. Martin's blood ran cold as he read the headlines. The airline he had led for 8 years was being crucified in the court of public opinion. Comments from angry citizens filled every platform, with many calling for boycotts of the airline. Some people were posting screenshots of canceled bookings, declaring they would never fly with the company again. The airline's official social media accounts were being flooded with thousands of comments demanding an apology and compensation for Sergeant Mitchell. Within the hour, Martin had assembled an emergency meeting with his senior management team at the airline's headquarters. The conference room filled with worried executives, all of them scrolling through their phones and tablets, watching in real time as their company's reputation crumbled. The head of customer service tried to defend the actions of the check-in staff, citing company policy about overbooking and passenger priorities. Martin silenced him with a single harsh look. The director of public relations laid out the grim reality. Major newspapers were preparing front-page stories for the morning edition. Television news programs were leading with the incident. Several members of parliament had already issued statements condemning the airline's treatment of a decorated war hero. Competitor airlines were subtly capitalizing on the situation by posting messages about their support for military personnel. The damage was escalating by the minute, and every moment of inaction made things worse. Martin made a decision that would cost the airline dearly in the short term, but might save it in the long run. He ordered his team to locate Sergeant Mitchell immediately and arrange for a personal apology. He also instructed the Public Relations Department to prepare a comprehensive statement acknowledging the mistake and announcing immediate policy changes regarding military personnel. The check-in supervisor and agent involved in the incident would be suspended pending a full investigation. Back at Heathrow, airport security approached James with a mixture of respect and urgency. They informed him that the airline's chief executive wanted to speak with him personally, and that a private car was being sent to take him to the airline's headquarters. James was confused by this sudden attention, but he agreed to go. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed people staring at him more intensely than before, and some even approached to shake his hand or take photographs with him. The drive to the airline's headquarters took 40 minutes through London's evening traffic. James sat in the back of the luxury car, finally checking his phone and discovering the explosion of media attention surrounding his incident. He scrolled through news articles and social media posts with a growing sense of disbelief. He had not sought this attention, had not wanted to become a public figure or a symbol of mistreatment. He simply wanted to get home to his mother. When James arrived at the airline's headquarters, Martin Bradshaw himself was waiting in the lobby to greet him. The executive looked exhausted and genuinely remorseful as he extended his hand and apologized profusely for the treatment James had received. He explained that the actions of his staff did not reflect the airline's values, and that immediate steps were being taken to ensure such an incident never happened again. James listened politely but remained guarded, unsure whether this apology was genuine or simply damage control. Martin led James to a comfortable office where a full meal had been prepared for him. The executive explained that the airline would provide James with first-class tickets for his journey home, departing that very evening on a special chartered flight if necessary. Additionally, the airline would make a substantial donation to a military charity of James's choosing and would implement new policies giving priority, boarding and special considerations to all military personnel traveling on their flights. Despite the generous offer, James felt uncomfortable with the attention. He appreciated the apology, but he could not help thinking about all the other soldiers who might have faced similar treatment without cameras recording the incident or social media amplifying their stories. He voiced this concern to Martin, who listened carefully and promised that the policy changes would be permanent and thoroughly enforced. James decided to accept the apology and the compensation, hoping it would bring positive change for other service members. Within 2 hours, James was boarding a first-class flight to his hometown, accompanied by a personal escort from the airline, who ensured every detail of his journey was perfect. The cabin crew treated him with exceptional care, offering him the finest food and drink the airline could provide. Other passengers in first class recognized him from the news and expressed their support, though James remained humble and somewhat embarrassed by all the attention. As the plane climbed into the night sky, James looked out the window at the lights of London disappearing below. He thought about how quickly his situation had changed, from being dismissed and humiliated to being treated like royalty. It all felt surreal, like a strange dream from which he might wake at any moment. He wondered if the attention would fade as quickly as it had appeared, or if this incident would follow him for the rest of his life. The airline's public relations team worked through the night, releasing statements and conducting damage control. Martin Bradshaw appeared on morning news programs the next day, personally apologizing for the incident and outlining the new policies the airline was implementing. The story began to shift from pure outrage to cautious optimism, with many people praising the airline for its swift response while others remained skeptical about whether the changes would be genuine or merely performative. James landed at his hometown airport in the early hours of the morning, where a small crowd of supporters and local media had gathered to welcome him home. He gave a brief statement thanking everyone for their support and asking for privacy so he could spend time with his mother. A police escort helped him navigate through the crowd and into a waiting car that would take him to his childhood home. When James finally walked through the door of his mother's house, she was waiting in her favorite chair by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the room. Tears streamed down both their faces as they embraced, holding each other tightly as if afraid to let go. His mother whispered that she had seen him on television and was so proud of him, not just for his military service but for handling the difficult situation with such grace and dignity. For James, this moment made everything worthwhile. 3 days after the airport incident, James was trying to settle back into civilian life at his mother's home. The small cottage on the outskirts of a quiet village had always been his sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world seemed distant and unimportant. His mother, Eleanor, moved slowly through the house with the help of a walking frame, but her spirit remained strong. She insisted on making James his favorite meals despite his protests that she should rest. The media attention had not faded as James had hoped. Reporters regularly knocked on the door requesting interviews. His phone rang constantly with calls from newspapers, television programs, and even international media outlets wanting to hear his story. James declined most requests, preferring to spend his time caring for his mother and reconnecting with the peaceful rhythms of village life. He took long walks through the countryside, visited the local pub where old friends welcomed him warmth, and tried to process everything that had happened. However, the story had reached far beyond the media and public consciousness. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, staff members had been closely monitoring the incident involving Sergeant James Mitchell. The royal household took matters concerning the armed forces very seriously, particularly when it involved someone who had been awarded the Victoria Cross, one of the highest military honors. A senior aide brought the matter to the attention of officials who managed the king's schedule and correspondence. King Charles III had always held a deep respect for the military, having served in the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force during his younger years. He regularly met with service members, attended military ceremonies, and took personal interest in the welfare of those who served the nation. When he learned about James Mitchell's treatment at the airport, followed by the airline's response, he felt compelled to do something more meaningful than simply acknowledge the situation from a distance. The king instructed his private secretary to arrange a private meeting with Sergeant Mitchell at Buckingham Palace. The invitation would be personal and discreet, not a public ceremony or media event. King Charles wanted to meet the young soldier, hear his story directly, and express the nation's gratitude for his service in a more intimate setting. The private secretary immediately set about making the arrangements, contacting the Ministry of Defense to coordinate the visit. When James received the call informing him of the king's invitation, he initially thought it was a prank. His military training had taught him to be skeptical of unexpected opportunities that seemed too good to be true. But after several official confirmations from the Ministry of Defense and a formal letter bearing the royal seal, James realized the invitation was genuine. His mother was overjoyed, her eyes sparkling with pride as she insisted they must find him a proper suit for the occasion. The following week, a car arrived at the cottage to transport James to London. His mother stood at the door waving goodbye, her face beaming with happiness despite her frail condition. James wore his military uniform, freshly pressed, with the Victoria Cross positioned exactly as regulations required. During the drive to London, he felt nervous in a way he had never experienced in combat. Meeting the king was an honor beyond anything he had imagined, and he wanted to represent his fellow soldiers with dignity. Buckingham Palace loomed magnificent and imposing as the car passed through the gates. Staff members greeted James with warm professionalism, guiding him through corridors adorned with priceless artwork and historical artifacts. The palace felt alive with history, every room whispering stories of centuries past. James tried to absorb every detail, knowing his mother would want to hear about everything he saw and experienced. A private secretary led James to a comfortable drawing room where he was asked to wait. The room featured elegant furniture, tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, and portraits of previous monarchs gazing down from the walls. James stood rather than sat, his military discipline keeping his posture straight despite his nervousness. He reviewed in his mind what he might say if given the opportunity to speak, though he suspected protocol would dictate most of their interaction. When King Charles entered the room, James immediately stood to attention and bowed as he had been instructed. The king approached with a warm smile and extended his hand, greeting James with genuine friendliness that immediately put him at ease. They sat together, and for the next hour they engaged in a conversation that felt more like two people sharing stories than a formal royal audience. The king asked about James's service, his experiences in combat, and the incident at the airport. James found himself speaking more freely than he had with anyone since returning home. He described the firefight where he had earned the Victoria Cross, the impossible choices made in split seconds, and the weight of knowing that 12 families still had their loved ones because of his actions that day. The king listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and showing a depth of understanding that could only come from someone who genuinely cared about military service. When the conversation turned to the airport incident, James admitted his feelings of frustration and helplessness at being treated dismissively despite his service. He explained that his concern was not for himself, but for other service members who might face similar treatment without the public attention his case had received. The king nodded thoughtfully, sharing his own views about the importance of ensuring military personnel received the respect and support they deserved. The king then surprised James by presenting him with a personal gift, a beautifully crafted pen made from wood taken from a tree that had stood on the grounds of Buckingham Palace for over 200 years. He explained that he wanted James to have something meaningful, a token that represented the enduring strength and resilience that James had demonstrated both in combat and in the face of unfair treatment. James accepted the gift with deep gratitude, moved by the personal nature of the gesture. Before James departed, King Charles expressed his intention to do more than simply acknowledge the airport incident. He explained that he would be speaking with government officials about improving support and recognition for military personnel in civilian settings. The king believed that service members deserved priority considerations, not because they were superior to other citizens, but because they had given so much in service to the nation and often returned home with physical and emotional challenges that required understanding and support. The meeting concluded with the king personally walking James to the palace entrance, an unusual gesture that demonstrated the genuine respect and connection they had formed. Staff members who witnessed this later commented that they had rarely seen the king spend so much personal time with a visitor or show such warmth towards someone outside the immediate royal circle. For James, the experience had been transformative, providing validation that his service mattered and that those in positions of power genuinely cared. As James rode back to his mother's cottage, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since his return from deployment. The airport incident, which had seemed like a humiliating low point, had somehow led to an extraordinary experience that he would treasure for the rest of his life. He thought about all the soldiers still serving overseas, facing dangers that most citizens would never understand, and he felt grateful that their sacrifices were recognized at the highest levels of society. When James arrived home, his mother was waiting eagerly to hear every detail of his visit to Buckingham Palace. They sat together by the fireplace as James recounted the entire experience, from the grandeur of the palace rooms to the genuine warmth of the king's conversation. Eleanor listened with tears of joy rolling down her cheeks, occasionally reaching out to squeeze her son's hand. She told him that his father, who had also served in the military decades earlier, would have been incredibly proud. That evening, as James helped his mother prepare for bed, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few weeks. He had gone from being anonymously dismissed at an airport to having tea with the King of England. The experience reminded him that life contained unexpected turns, that moments of disappointment could lead to opportunities for growth and recognition, and that standing firm in one's principles, even in the face of unfair treatment, could ultimately lead to positive change. 2 weeks after his meeting with King Charles, James received another unexpected communication. This time it came from the Ministry of Defense, informing him that he had been selected to participate in a new initiative aimed at improving the transition experience for military personnel returning to civilian life. The program would involve James sharing his experiences with fellow service members and helping to develop better support systems for veterans facing challenges similar to what he had encountered at the airport. James felt conflicted about taking on such a role. Part of him wanted to return to the quiet anonymity of village life, to care for his mother and leave the public spotlight behind. But another part recognized the opportunity to make a meaningful difference for soldiers who might not have the same platform or support that he had received. After discussing the matter with his mother and several trusted friends from his military unit, James decided to accept the position. The work took James to military bases across the country, where he met with soldiers preparing to complete their service and transition to civilian careers. He spoke honestly about his own struggles, including the airport incident and the feelings of being undervalued despite his military accomplishments. The soldiers responded to his authenticity, opening up about their own fears and concerns regarding life after military service. Many worried about finding employment, dealing with physical and emotional trauma, and losing the sense of purpose and brotherhood that military life provided. During one particularly moving session at a base in Scotland, a young corporal named David approached James after his presentation. David was scheduled to leave the military in 3 months after serving 2 tours in hostile territories. He confessed that he was terrified about returning to civilian life, that he had nightmares about being treated as invisible or irrelevant by a society that did not understand what soldiers experienced. James spent over an hour talking with David, sharing strategies for coping with the transition and reminding him that his service had value regardless of how individual civilians might treat him. James also began working with the airline that had originally mistreated him. Despite the rocky beginning, the company's leadership had proven sincere in their desire to change. They invited James to help develop training programs for their staff, teaching them about military culture and the importance of showing respect and understanding to service members. James initially hesitated to work with the company, but he recognized that transforming the organization from within could create lasting positive change. The airline's training sessions proved eye-opening for employees who had never considered the unique challenges faced by military personnel. James shared statistics about veteran unemployment, mental health struggles, and the difficulty of reintegrating into society after spending years in a completely different world. He told stories about soldiers who had returned home only to find themselves feeling disconnected and misunderstood. The training helped airline staff see military passengers not just as customers, but as individuals who deserved special consideration and gratitude. Meanwhile, the media attention surrounding James's story continued to generate conversations about how society treated its veterans. Parliament debated new legislation that would provide additional protections and benefits for military personnel. Several major companies announced policies giving preferential treatment to veterans in hiring and customer service. While some critics argued that these measures amounted to special treatment, most citizens supported the initiatives as fair recognition for those who had served the nation. James's mother's health began to decline more noticeably as autumn turned to winter. The cottage that had always felt warm and welcoming now seemed cold despite the fire constantly burning in the fireplace. Eleanor's doctors advised that she needed more intensive care than James could provide at home, but she stubbornly refused to consider moving to a care facility. She insisted that she wanted to remain in the home where she had raised her son and spent decades with her late husband. James reduced his travel schedule to spend more time at home, taking over all the household responsibilities and ensuring his mother received the best possible care. Local villagers who had known the Mitchell family for generations regularly stopped by with meals, groceries, and companionship. The community rallied around them with the kind of support that only small villages can provide, where everyone knows everyone and neighbors truly care for one another. One evening, as James sat reading beside his mother's bed, she took his hand and spoke with surprising strength in her voice. She told him how proud she was of everything he had accomplished, not just his military service, but the way he had handled adversity with grace and used his experience to help others. She made him promise that after she was gone, he would continue the work he had started, advocating for veterans and ensuring that no soldier felt undervalued or forgotten by the society they had served. James struggled to hold back tears as he made that promise, knowing that his mother's time was growing short. They spent the next few weeks in quiet companionship, sharing memories of his childhood, his father's military service, and the values that had shaped their family across generations. Eleanor told stories James had never heard before, about his grandfather's service in World War II and his great-grandfather's experiences in World War I. Military service ran deep in their family's history, a tradition of sacrifice and duty that James now carried forward. The airline's chief executive, Martin Bradshaw, personally reached out to James during this difficult time. He had learned about Eleanor's declining health Through the contacts they had maintained since the airport incident, Martin offered to provide any support the family needed, including private medical consultations, home care services, or anything else that might ease their burden. James was touched by the gesture, recognizing that Martin's concern was genuine rather than a public relations strategy. With Martin's help, James was able to arrange for a team of private nurses to care for his mother at home, allowing her to remain in the place she loved surrounded by familiar comforts. The quality of her final weeks improved dramatically, with professional medical support ensuring she remained comfortable and pain-free. James spent every possible moment at her side, reading to her, playing her favorite music, and simply holding her hand. During one of Eleanor's more alert days, she asked James to show her the pen that King Charles had given him. She held it carefully, running her fingers over the smooth wood, and smiled with deep satisfaction. She told James that this gift symbolized everything important: the recognition of his service, the acknowledgement of his character, and the bridge between military tradition and modern society that he was helping to build. She made him promise to use the pen to sign important documents and to always remember what it represented. As winter deepened and snow began to fall on the village, Eleanor peacefully passed away in her sleep with James sitting in the chair beside her bed. The funeral brought together an unexpected gathering of people whose lives James had touched: military comrades who traveled from across the country, villagers who had known Eleanor for decades, airline employees who had participated in James's training programs, and representatives from the Ministry of Defense. Martin Bradshaw attended personally, sitting quietly in the back of the church and paying his respects to a woman he had never met, but whose son had changed his company's culture. After the funeral, James stood at his mother's grave as the last visitors departed, snow falling gently around him. He thought about the promise he had made to her, and the responsibility he now carried alone. The cottage would feel impossibly empty without his mother's presence, but he knew she would want him to continue forward, to honor her memory by living according to the values she had instilled in him. That evening, James sat at his mother's desk and used the pen from King Charles to write letters to several people who had supported him during the difficult months since the airport incident. He wrote to Martin Bradshaw, thanking him for his genuine transformation and continued support. He wrote to the king's private secretary, expressing gratitude for the meeting that had meant so much to both him and his mother. He wrote to David, the young corporal from Scotland, encouraging him to stay strong during his transition to civilian life. As James sealed the letters and prepared them for mailing, he felt his mother's presence in the room, not as a ghost or supernatural phenomenon, but as the enduring influence of her love and wisdom. She had taught him about duty, sacrifice, compassion, and the importance of standing up for what was right even when it came at personal cost. These lessons would guide him forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. Spring arrived 3 months after Eleanor's passing, bringing new life to the countryside around the cottage. James had spent the winter months sorting through his mother's belongings, a painful but necessary process that forced him to confront memories from every stage of his life. He found photographs of his father in military uniform, letters his parents had exchanged during his father's deployments, and a journal his mother had kept documenting James's childhood. Reading her words about his first day of school, his decision to join the military, and her pride in his achievements brought both tears and comfort. The Ministry of Defense contacted James with a significant proposal. They wanted to expand the veteran transition program he had been helping to develop into a nationwide initiative. The position would require James to relocate to London and take on a full-time role coordinating support services for thousands of transitioning service members annually. The salary was generous, and the opportunity to make a systematic difference for veterans across the country was exactly the kind of meaningful work his mother had encouraged him to pursue. James accepted the position without hesitation, knowing that this was how he could best honor his mother's memory and fulfill the promise he had made to her. He arranged to rent out the cottage to a young family from the village, ensuring the home would be cared for and lived in rather than left empty and deteriorating. Packing his belongings felt like closing a chapter of his life, but he took comfort in knowing he could return to visit whenever he needed to reconnect with his roots. London felt overwhelming after months in the quiet countryside. The constant noise, the crowds of people, The rushed pace of city life contrasted sharply with the peaceful rhythms James had grown accustomed to. His new apartment was modern and comfortable, but lacked the character and warmth of the cottage. However, James threw himself into his work with characteristic dedication, determined to build something that would genuinely help the military community. The veteran transition program took shape quickly under James's leadership. He assembled a team of former service members who understood the challenges firsthand, psychologists who specialized in military trauma, and career counselors experienced in translating military skills to civilian employment opportunities. Together, they created a comprehensive support system that addressed everything from mental health services to job placement assistance to basic life skills like managing finances and navigating healthcare systems. One of James's first initiatives was establishing partnerships with major employers across various industries. He personally met with corporate executives, explaining how veterans brought valuable skills like leadership, discipline, problem-solving abilities, and the capacity to perform under pressure. Many companies responded enthusiastically, creating dedicated hiring programs for veterans and adapting their corporate cultures to better accommodate former military personnel. The airline that had once dismissed James became one of the program's strongest supporters, hiring dozens of veterans and implementing industry-leading policies for military passengers. James also worked to change government policies regarding veteran support. He testified before parliamentary committees, sharing his personal experiences and the stories of countless other veterans who had struggled with the transition to civilian life. His testimony was powerful and articulate, backed by data showing the economic and social costs of failing to properly support veterans. Gradually, new legislation took shape that expanded healthcare benefits, improved educational opportunities, and created financial incentives for companies that hired veterans. The work was exhausting but deeply fulfilling. James regularly received messages from veterans whose lives had been transformed by the program. A former combat medic wrote to thank him for helping her find a position with the National Health Service, where her skills were valued and utilized. A retired sergeant described how the mental health services had saved his marriage and possibly his life. A young corporal shared that the career counseling had helped him discover a passion for teaching, and he was now working at a secondary school inspiring the next generation. 6 months into his new role, James received an invitation to speak at a major conference on veteran affairs attended by military leaders, government officials, and representatives from organizations supporting veterans. He spent weeks preparing his speech, wanting to strike the right balance between acknowledging progress and highlighting areas where more work was needed. The night before the conference, he sat in his apartment reviewing his notes and felt a familiar nervousness that reminded him of waiting to meet King Charles. The conference took place in a grand hotel in central London, with hundreds of attendees filling an elegant ballroom. James took the stage wearing his military uniform, the Victoria Cross once again pinned to his chest. He began his speech by telling the story of the airport incident, describing his feelings of humiliation and helplessness in detail. The room fell silent as he spoke, every person hanging on his words. Then he explained how that negative experience had ultimately led to positive changes, but only because the public and key leaders had responded with genuine commitment to improvement. James outlined the specific challenges veterans faced during transition, supporting each point with statistics and personal stories that made the data come alive. He spoke about veterans struggling with unemployment, despite having years of leadership experience. He described former soldiers dealing with mental health issues in silence because they feared being perceived as weak. He highlighted the disconnect between military culture and civilian society that left many veterans feeling isolated and misunderstood. The speech reached its emotional peak when James spoke about his mother. He described her unwavering support, her pride in his service, and the promise he had made to her before she died. His voice cracked slightly as he explained that every veteran deserved someone who believed in them the way his mother had believed in him, and that society as a whole needed to become that supportive presence for those who had served. When he finished speaking, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. After the conference, James was approached by dozens of people wanting to discuss his work and offer support for the Veteran Transition Program. Among them was General Sir Richard Harrison, a senior military official who had been instrumental in shaping defense policy for decades. The general invited James to lunch, where they discussed strategies for expanding veteran support services and ensuring sustainable funding for these initiatives. The general was impressed by James's combination of personal authenticity and strategic thinking. Through the general's connections, James gained access to decision-makers who could accelerate policy changes and secure resources for veteran programs. Within months, the transition program received significant government funding increases and support from major charitable foundations. James's team expanded to include regional coordinators across the country, ensuring that veterans in every area had access to comprehensive support services regardless of where they lived. The program's success brought James recognition he had never sought. He received awards from veteran organizations, invitations to speak at universities, and requests for media interviews. He remained uncomfortable with personal attention, always redirecting praise toward his team and the veterans they served. However, he recognized that his public profile gave him a platform to advocate for issues that might otherwise be ignored, so he accepted the responsibility that came with visibility. One particularly meaningful development came from an unexpected source. Sandra, the airline agent who had dismissed James at the airport check-in counter, reached out through the airline's corporate office requesting a meeting. James was surprised by the request but agreed to meet with her. They sat in a quiet coffee shop, and Sandra tearfully apologized for her actions that day. She explained that she had been dealing with personal stress and had treated him dismissively without considering his circumstances or showing basic human compassion. Sandra told James that watching the aftermath of the incident had forced her to confront her own attitudes and behavior. She had voluntarily participated in all of the airline's new training programs and had become an advocate within the company for treating military personnel with respect and consideration. She asked if there was any way she could contribute to his veteran support work, perhaps by sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the importance of empathy and awareness. James was moved by Sandra's genuine remorse and her desire to make amends. He invited her to participate in training sessions where she spoke honestly about her mistake and what she had learned from it. Her willingness to be vulnerable and accountable resonated powerfully with other airline employees and service industry workers. She became an unexpected but effective advocate for the cause, demonstrating that people could grow and change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. As the first anniversary of the airport incident approached, James reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with that moment of humiliation. He had gone from feeling powerless and dismissed to leading a national program helping thousands of veterans. He had met the king, changed corporatin. 2 years after the airport incident, James received another invitation from Buckingham Palace. This time, King Charles wanted to personally recognize the achievements of the Veteran Transition Program and James's leadership in transforming how society supported former military personnel. The invitation specified that this would be a formal ceremony with media coverage, as the king wanted to use the occasion to highlight the importance of veteran support and encourage other organizations to follow the examples that had been set. James felt nervous about such a public event, preferring the behind-the-scenes work of building systems and helping individuals. However, he understood the strategic value of royal recognition in drawing attention to veteran issues and inspiring continued support for the programs. He agreed to participate, knowing that his personal discomfort was insignificant compared to the potential benefits for the veteran community. The ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning at Buckingham Palace. James arrived early, wearing his military uniform with the Victoria Cross and several other service medals earned throughout his career. The palace grounds buzzed with activity as staff prepared for the event, and media crews set up cameras and equipment. James was escorted to a waiting area where he met other individuals being recognized for various contributions to society. Among those being honored was Martin Bradshaw, the airline executive who had apologized to James and led his company's transformation regarding military personnel. Martin had become a genuine advocate for veteran causes, using his influence in the business community to encourage other companies to adopt similar policies. When he spotted James, they embraced warmly, their relationship having evolved from adversarial to genuinely friendly over the months of working together. The ceremony began with all honorees gathered in one of the palace's magnificent staterooms. King Charles entered and personally greeted each individual before the formal proceedings. When he reached James, the king smiled with recognition and warmth. He told James that he had been following the progress of the veteran transition program with great interest and admiration. The king mentioned that he regularly received reports about the program's impact and had personally intervened several times to ensure it received the government support it deserved. The formal ceremony included speeches from military leaders and government officials, praising the various honorees. When it came time to recognize James, the king himself spoke about their first meeting, the airport incident that had sparked national conversation, and the remarkable transformation that had resulted from one man's determination to turn personal adversity into systemic change. The king presented James with a special commendation for his service both in combat and in civilian advocacy for veterans. After the ceremony, a reception allowed honorees to mingle with palace officials, military leaders, and prominent figures from various sectors of British society. James found himself in conversations with people who controlled significant resources and influence. Several business leaders approached him about partnering with the Veteran Transition Program. Charitable foundations offered additional funding. Politicians sought his advice on pending legislation related to military affairs. One conversation proved particularly impactful. James met Lady Catherine Morrison, a philanthropist whose late husband had been a decorated military officer who struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder after leaving the service. Lady Morrison had established a foundation in her husband's memory, and she wanted to make veteran mental health services the foundation's primary focus. She asked James to help design programs that would provide long-term psychological support for veterans dealing with trauma, depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges. James immediately recognized the tremendous potential of this partnership. Mental health remained one of the most critical and underfunded aspects of veteran support. Many former service members suffered in silence, unable to access quality care or unwilling to seek help due to stigma. With Lady Morrison's resources and commitment, combined with the expertise of James's team, they could create comprehensive mental health services that reached veterans across the country. Over the following months, James worked closely with Lady Morrison and her foundation to develop an innovative mental health program. They recruited leading psychologists specializing in military trauma, established residential treatment facilities in peaceful rural settings, created peer support networks where veterans could connect with others who understood their experiences, and launched a confidential helpline staffed around the clock by trained counselors with military backgrounds. The mental health initiative launched with significant media attention, thanks partly to Lady Morrison's prominence and the royal recognition James had received. Veterans who had been struggling alone for years suddenly had access to comprehensive support services. The program's approach emphasized that seeking mental health care was a sign of strength rather than weakness, that addressing psychological wounds was as important as treating physical injuries, and that recovery was possible with proper support. David, the young corporal James had mentored in Scotland, became one of the mental health program's first participants. After leaving the military, David had struggled significantly with nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty adjusting to civilian employment. He had reached out to James in desperation, and James immediately connected him with the new services. Through months of therapy, peer support, and gradual reintegration into civilian life, David began to heal. His recovery became a powerful testimony to the program's effectiveness. James also continued expanding the employment aspects of the Veteran Transition Program. He developed partnerships with universities offering accelerated degree programs for veterans, created apprenticeship opportunities in skilled trades, and established entrepreneurship training for veterans interested in starting their own businesses. The program took a holistic approach, recognizing that successful transition required addressing multiple dimensions of life simultaneously. One evening, while working late at his office in London, James received an unexpected email from Rebecca Thompson, the journalist whose social media post about the airport incident had first brought his story to public attention. She was writing a book about how individual acts of courage and advocacy could spark broader social change, and she wanted to feature James's story as a central case study. She requested an in-depth interview and permission to document the Veteran Transition Program's work. James initially hesitated, uncomfortable with being portrayed as a hero or central figure in a narrative that involved so many people's contributions. However, Rebecca explained that the book's purpose was to inspire others to stand up for what was right and to demonstrate that ordinary people could create extraordinary change. She argued that James's story, from the airport humiliation through the royal recognition to the creation of nationwide support systems, perfectly illustrated the potential for individual action to generate systemic transformation. After consulting with his team and considering the potential benefits for veteran advocacy, James agreed to participate in the book project. Over several months, Rebecca conducted extensive interviews with James, members of his team, veterans who had been helped by the programs, and various people involved in the story, from King Charles's staff to Martin Bradshaw to Sandra, the former airline agent. The resulting book painted a comprehensive picture of how a single incident had catalyzed meaningful change across multiple institutions. The book's publication generated renewed interest in veteran issues and brought even more resources and attention to the transition program. Sales proceeds went directly to veteran support organizations, generating significant additional funding. The book was adopted by military leadership training programs as a case study in servant leadership and mission-driven work. Universities used it in courses about social change and advocacy. The ripple effects continued to expand. As James approached his third year leading the veteran transition program, he took stock of what had been accomplished. Thousands of veterans had successfully transitioned to civilian careers with the program's support. Mental health services had helped hundreds of former service members address psychological wounds and rebuild their lives. Corporate policies had changed across multiple industries to better accommodate and support military personnel. Government legislation had expanded benefits and protections for veterans. Most importantly, public awareness and appreciation for veteran issues had grown significantly. Yet James remained focused on the work still to be done. He knew that despite all the progress, veterans continued to face significant challenges. Homelessness among veterans remained too high. Suicide rates were still unacceptably elevated. Some employers continued to overlook veterans in favor of candidates with traditional civilian backgrounds. James was determined to keep pushing for improvements until every veteran received the support and recognition they deserved. 5 years after the airport incident that had changed his life, James stood once again at his mother's grave in the quiet village churchyard. The seasons had cycled through spring blossoms, summer warmth, autumn colors, and winter snows multiple times since her passing. Each visit brought both sadness and comfort, a connection to his roots and the values that had shaped him. Today marked the 5th anniversary of her death, and James had traveled from London specifically to spend time in reflection at the place where she rested. The cottage had been lovingly maintained by the family renting it, and James occasionally visited to walk through the rooms filled with childhood memories. The village had remained largely unchanged, a pocket of traditional life in a rapidly modernizing world. Local residents still greeted James warmly whenever he returned, proud of his accomplishments but treating him as the same person who had grown up among them, rather than as a national figure. The veteran transition program had evolved beyond anything James had initially imagined. It now operated in every region of the United Kingdom, with a staff of over 200 people, most of them veterans themselves who understood the challenges firsthand. The program had become a model studied by other nations seeking to improve their own veteran support systems. Delegations from countries around the world regularly visited to learn about the British approach and adapt its successful elements to their own contexts. James had recently been approached about an even more ambitious opportunity. An international veterans organization wanted him to lead a global initiative, bringing together veteran support programs from multiple countries to share best practices, coordinate resources, and advocate for improved treatment of former military personnel worldwide. The position would require extensive travel and would take him away from the hands-on work in Britain that he loved, but it represented a chance to amplify the impact of everything he had learned and built. The decision weighed heavily on James. He thought about his mother's advice to always seek opportunities to help others and make a meaningful difference. He considered the thousands of veterans across the globe who struggled with transitions similar to what he had experienced. He reflected on his own journey from decorated soldier to dismissed airline passenger, to royal honoree to national advocate. Each phase had prepared him for greater responsibilities and broader impact. David, the former corporal James had mentored, had become one of the veteran transition program's most effective counselors. His personal experience with mental health, challenges, and successful recovery made him particularly relatable to veterans who were struggling. David had found his calling in helping others navigate the difficulties he had overcome, and he frequently told people that James had saved his life by connecting him with the right support at the right time. Their relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared mission. The airline that had once dismissed James had become an industry leader in supporting military personnel and veterans. Their policies regarding priority boarding, flexible scheduling for military families, and preferential hiring of veterans were now considered the gold standard that other airlines attempted to match. Martin Bradshaw had retired as chief executive, but remained actively involved in veteran advocacy, serving on the board of several organizations and using his business expertise to help them operate more effectively. Sandra, the check-in agent, whose dismissive treatment had sparked the original incident, had become a powerful voice for change within the customer service industry. She regularly spoke at conferences about the importance of empathy, awareness, and treating every customer with dignity, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Her transformation from someone who had made a serious mistake to someone who dedicated her career to preventing others from making similar mistakes demonstrated the potential for growth and redemption. King Charles had maintained an interest in James's work throughout the years, occasionally inviting him to Buckingham Palace to discuss veteran issues and provide updates on the transition program's progress. The king had personally intervened several times when bureaucratic obstacles threatened funding or policy changes, using his influence behind the scenes to ensure continued support for veteran initiatives. Their relationship, which had begun with a single meeting meant to acknowledge James's mistreatment, had developed into an ongoing collaboration focused on meaningful change. Lady Morrison's Mental Health Foundation had helped over 3,000 veterans address psychological trauma through its comprehensive programs. The success rates were remarkable, with the vast majority of participants reporting significant improvement in their quality of life, relationships, and ability to function in civilian society. The foundation had expanded beyond the United Kingdom, establishing partnerships with similar organizations in other countries to share expertise and resources. James had also witnessed the broader cultural shift regarding how society viewed and treated veterans. Public awareness of veteran issues had increased dramatically. More employers actively sought to hire veterans, recognizing the valuable skills and perspectives they brought to civilian workplaces. Schools incorporated veteran experiences into history and civics curricula, helping young people understand the sacrifices made by military personnel. Media coverage of veteran issues had become more nuanced and thoughtful, moving beyond simple hero narratives to explore the complex realities of military service and its aftermath. As James sat beside his mother's grave, he pulled out the pen that King Charles had given him years earlier. He had used it to sign countless important documents related to veteran programs, policy changes, and partnership agreements. Now he used it to write a letter to his mother, expressing thoughts and feelings that he had carried silently for years. He wrote about the promise he had made to her and how he had worked to fulfill it. He described the lives that had been changed and the systems that had been improved. He thanked her for the values she had instilled and the unwavering support she had provided throughout his life. The letter remained unread except by James himself, but the act of writing it provided a sense of completion and connection. He folded the pages carefully and placed them in his jacket pocket, carrying his mother's presence with him as he always did. As he stood to leave the churchyard, James felt at peace with the decision he had already made in his heart. He would accept the international position and work to extend the impact of veteran support programs globally. Before returning to London, James visited the local pub where he had spent countless evenings with childhood friends and fellow villagers. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, filled with familiar faces and the comfortable conversations of people who had known each other for decades. The pub owner, a retired Army sergeant himself, bought James a pint and they talked about football, local gossip, and the weather, carefully avoiding any mention of James's accomplishments or public profile. It was exactly what James needed, a reminder that beneath all the recognition and responsibility, he remained a regular person with roots in this small village. The following week, James formally accepted the international position and began transitioning his responsibilities for the British Veteran Transition Program to David and other senior team members he had mentored over the years. He felt confident that the program would continue to thrive under their leadership, having built systems and a culture that did not depend on any single individual. The true measure of his success was not his personal indispensability, but rather the sustainability and effectiveness of the organization he had created. James's final act before focusing on his new international role was to establish an endowment fund in his mother's name. The Eleanor Mitchell Memorial Fund would provide scholarships for children of deceased veterans, helping to ensure that families who had sacrificed so much would have opportunities for education and advancement. The fund was seeded with proceeds from Rebecca Thompson's book about James's story, along with contributions from the many people and organizations who had been touched by the Veteran Transition Program's work. On his last day in the British program's office, James's team organized a surprise celebration acknowledging his leadership and contributions. Veterans whose lives had been transformed by the program traveled from across the country to attend. They shared stories about how the program had helped them find employment, address mental health challenges, reconnect with families, and rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. Many had tears in their eyes as they thanked James for creating something that had given them hope when they felt most lost. James was deeply moved by their words, but he reminded everyone that the work had been collective rather than individual. He pointed out the contributions of his team members, the support from organizations like Lady Morrison's Foundation, the policy changes achieved through partnerships with government officials, and most importantly, the courage of veterans themselves who had done the difficult work of rebuilding their lives. He emphasized that his role had simply been to create systems and opportunities, while the real heroes were the veterans who had seized those opportunities and transformed themselves. As James prepared to begin his international work, he reflected on the extraordinary Zhu